Hi, so this session we're going to continue with our discussion of different instruments that governments can use to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we previously talked about putting a carbon tax or an emissions tax. We talked about an emissions trading scheme. In this session we're going to talk about regulations. So first we'll talk about some examples of regulations. So one type of regulation is we have, say, a minimum share of renewable energy, say solar, wind and hydro, by a certain date. So in Australia, for example, we have a target that by 2020, 20% of our energy will be renewable. At the moment, it's less than 10%, so that's a big change. An alternative regulation might be, we'll say, you can build no more coal-fired power stations. So there are restrictions on regulations. Or we could have regulations on cars. Remember, burning of petroleum products is a source of greenhouse gas emissions. So we could have a regulation that cars can't have more than a certain horsepower, or they must limit the amount of greenhouse gas emissions per kilometre travelled. We could have regulations that in your lighting of your buildings and your houses, you must use fluorescent light bulbs rather than incandescent light bulbs. Now it turns out the fluorescent light bulbs use a lot less energy, so less electricity, less pollution, than do incandescent light bulbs. But in most countries, the incandescent light bulbs are the cheap ones, and so when we ignore greenhouse gas emissions, we buy the cheapest one. The regulation would say, no, you must buy a light bulb that minimises the amount of pollution. We could think of some fairly tough regulations that says you could only drive cars on alternate days. Or we could be really tough on students and say they can't drive to university at all, you have to catch public transport, or walk, or ride a bicycle. Or we could have regulations that stop us from cutting down forests. Because remember, forests, part of the thing trees do is they absorb carbon dioxide. Or we might have other regulations that require us to plant more forests. So parts of agriculture have to be converted to forest land, or if ever you clear trees, you must plant at least the same number of trees. These are all regulation examples that are designed to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change down the track. So what are the effects of regulation for less polluting production? Essentially, the challenge is that regulation requires us to choose more expensive production methods. So for example, if I don't worry about pollution, I might use coal-fired electricity that pollutes because it's much cheaper than, say, solar or wind. That doesn't pollute, but it's more expensive. Now what those higher costs do is it means that it costs more to produce a particular product, but of course it has less pollution. So again, if we were to shift from coal to solar electricity, then we get less pollution, but the cost of electricity per kilowatt hour that businesses buy or that you and I buy goes up. And this forces up the supply curve, and we'll illustrate that in detail in the next slide. As a result of the highest regulation pushing up our costs of production, we have less pollution per product. So there's less pollution per unit of electricity because more of it's produced with solar. So that's reducing our pollution. At the higher price and costs of production, we end up consuming less of the polluting product. So households and businesses now find that electricity is more expensive. They find ways to reduce their electricity consumption. What's interesting is even though business may face the higher production costs, they end up passing it on to you and I as higher prices. And so signals go all the way through the system that these pollution-intensive products are much more expensive. What we've done is tried to internalise the pollution costs associated with their production. Now, unlike the tax and the emissions trading scheme, regulations don't give any tax revenue to government. So we can see this story a little bit. Again, we go back to our old diagram, where on our horizontal axis here we've got the quantity of a desired product, so more electricity, more transport, and on the vertical axis we've got its price. Now, before we have any regulations, we're operating on this supply curve, so that's covering the costs of fuel, labour and capital, but it's assuming we can dump the pollution into the atmosphere for free. We have a downward sloping demand curve, and our initial equilibrium is where those two curves cross. Now, what the regulation does, for example, saying that we have to have a certain share of our electricity as from renewables, or we don't allow any more coal-fired power stations, is going to force upwards the cost of production per unit of electricity production. So in economics, that means we shift the supply curve up from this S to the S dash, where we've included the regulations. So what's happening then in this green economy, we move to a new equilibrium. So we've reduced the amount of electricity, so there's less pollution from that point of view, but we've also reduced the amount of pollution per unit of electricity, and we also note that the price of electricity has gone up, and that's given incentives to households and businesses to find cheaper ways of operating their homes with less of this polluting electricity. So how good an instrument to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is a regulation? And particularly we want to compare it with the price generated either by an emissions tax or by an emissions trading scheme. In general, we only have a certain amount of regulations. And as we've known, almost every household and every business could change decisions to reduce pollution. Regulations are only going to pick on a subset of those. Yes, the regulation is going to give us higher costs of production and less consumption. So consumers lose because we're having to pay more for some products like electricity. And that's a bit like the area under the marginal abatement cost curve. That's the higher price story. Producers pass on most of the cost to households, so they don't lose that much in profits, but they're producing a little bit less of these polluting products. On the other hand, if you're producing non-polluting products, you're going to be a big winner. In general, regulations are selective and not cost effective, and we'll illustrate that in the next couple slides. So think of a world where we've got electricity produced from the burning of fossil fuels. This is our diagram on the left. And we've got transport, our diagram on the right, that's burning fossil fuels. And at the moment, the price of fossil fuels is zero. Not the price of fossils, the price of pollution is free. So we're going to operate where the max equal to zero. So this is going to be our starting point, quantity business usual of electricity and quantity business as usual of transport. Now we introduce a regulation and we want to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas pollution. A fairly sensible one would be to say, well, let's restrict the amount of electricity used by 30%. Let's move from Q business as usual to Q hat, and also restrict the amount of transport by 30%. That's kind of equitable, that's sensible. It's pretty simple for government to implement. But the truth of the matter is, as shown in this diagram, the MAC curves, the marginal abatement cost curves, have different slopes. So in electricity, it's relatively flat, saying it's fairly easy to reduce the amount of pollution by moving from, say, coal to gas and then to renewables. On the other hand, the MAC, the marginal abatement cost for transport, is pretty steep. It's really hard to run cars that don't use fossil fuels. Even if we go to things like electric cars, they have to have the electricity, and often that comes from the burning of fossil fuels. So one of the consequences of our story is, in the transport story where the MAC is very steep, the pollution cost at that quota is relatively high at PT. On the other hand, with the electricity where it's quite easy to reduce the pollution, then the marginal abatement cost only goes up a little bit, whereas for transport, it's gone up by a long way. Is that really a cheap way of reducing pollution? Well, let's again take this diagram and suppose here we are at our current points with the regulations, and the electricity guys have a little bit of a discussion with the transport guys. We still want to reduce pollution by 30%. They say, well, look, the last unit of pollution that I reduced only cost me PE, suppose that's $1, and the transport guy says, well, the last unit of electricity I reduced cost me a fortune. It cost me up here at 10. Why don't we do a bit of a deal? Why don't you let me do a little bit more pollution and I'll save $10, and you reduce your pollution a little bit, it'll only cost you $1. We're going to be $9 ahead. Just think of how many extra bottles of beer and wine we can buy with this extra trading. And they're going to continue to do this trading all the way till we get to a common price, P star. So the transport guys are not going to do much pollution reduction at all, but the electricity guys, who can reduce it in a big way, will do a lot more pollution reduction. And basically, the increased pollution by the transport guys is going to equal the reduction in pollution by the electricity guys. We've got the same amount of pollution, but we've picked up big savings in costs. And in fact, we can show that these cost savings are this rectangle B to the transport industry and this triangle A for the electricity industry. It's a win-win. What you note is that if that trading goes on, we end up with a common price P star, so the marginal abatement cost for electricity is the same as it is for transport. That's what an emissions tax or an emissions trading scheme would do that isn't done by a regulation. So let us draw together a comparison of a market-based tax or emissions trading scheme versus regulations. So if we think of the emissions tax or an emissions trading scheme that imposes a common price per unit of pollution. So individuals draw on their information as to what are the activities they should change to reduce pollution. If they can reduce pollution for less than the price, then they'll do it. If their current pollution is more expensive than the market price, then they'll either pay the tax or purchase a tradable permit. So what we end up doing is equating the marginal abatement cost across all the possible types of pollution in the economy. And that's a least cost way of reducing pollution. By contrast, if we look at regulations, government has to choose particular activities for pollution reduction, And remember that there are millions of decisions that most households and businesses can take to reduce pollution. Government's not going to pick every one of those. They're going to be in the game of picking winners. And no matter how good public servants are, no matter how dedicated, they will pick some losers. So the result is that we end up with a different marginal abatement cost across the different pollution activities. And this is a much more costly way to reduce the aggregate level of pollution. So this slide is a kind of summary of why economists would say, if you want to reduce pollution in a cost-effective way, don't go the regulation route. It's too difficult, it's too expensive. Go the market-based price route, either an emissions tax or a tradable permit scheme.